Hey guys, this is Brandon Bruni here, and welcome to my presentation for medieval castles entitled Hohenschwangau and Neuschwanstein and the Artist Who Would Be King. Let me preface this presentation by stating, unfortunately, I'm working from iOS to create this PowerPoint, and I discovered far too late that you cannot add any recording onto slides in iOS for some reason. So I'm having to do this via screen capture and create a video, which means I'm also going to be doing this in roughly one take and speaking entirely extemporaneously throughout. So please forgive me for any ums or ahs or any poor German pronunciation. But let's get started. So, first of all, what's with this title? What are these places? Well, Hohenschwangau and Neuschwanstein are two castles located in Bavaria, Germany. Now, they are from the 19th century, not strictly within the confines of our class, but this was on the suggested topic list, and it's extremely fascinating. And further, they do have their roots in Middle Age castles, and we will discuss that as we get into that. Further, who is the artist who would be king? Well, that is a reference to the person who is commonly known as Mad King Ludwig or King Ludwig II. But as we'll see, that is a slightly more complicated moniker for the man. So here we are, Mad King Ludwig himself. Now, traditionally, you'll see King Ludwig often depicted in military garb or in his coronation outfit, perhaps. But really, he was not very fond of these trappings. I actually despised the whole military aspect of his job, and was most often dressed in these more plain clothes. In fact, apparently, his only indication generally that he was even the monarch would be some kind of pin. As you can see, they're located on his cravat or maybe on a hat. In any case, let's talk a little bit about him because Ludwig II was the king of Bavaria and lived from 1845 to 1886. And unfortunately, in that time, oversaw a pretty challenging time in Bavarian history, essentially when Bavaria as an independent nation came to an end, and we'll get into that. But also, he was a prolific castle builder and architect. He had a number of structures like that, all of them paid from his own funds. And he also was deeply obsessed with the French monarchy. So, all of that is to say, if you're a German at the time of the German reunification in the Franco Prussian War, and you're obsessed with France, they're probably going to think something about you. And if you're spending all of your personal funds to build a bunch of castles in a time where castles would not have been a very good defensive structure, people think a little oddly of you. He was a strange fellow, he was a recluse. But also, I want to bring some nuance to the discussion because King Ludwig II had an artist's soul. And as such, he reflected that in his building. And I wanted to kind of go into his background a little bit and compare his boyhood home at Hohenschwangau to his subsequent work on Neuschwanstein. So, in short, by comparing the Hohenschwangau Castle of King Ludwig II's upbringing with his subsequent work on Neuschwanstein Castle, this presentation will assert that his traumatic boyhood within such fantastical medieval trappings led directly to his lifelong fascination with mythic storytelling and a need to escape the world in which he inhabited. Now, that seems like a pretty broad stroke. Easy for me to say, perhaps, but there's a lot of primary source writing about him, including his own diaries, as well as a lot of contemporaneous accounts that utilizes those sources. So we know that there was actually a little more to it than that. His moniker of mad may have been a bit unfair, and I want to unpack that a bit because by comparing these two structures directly, the one in which he grew up in and the one that he built later, and just side of it, and you'll see some photos later to indicate that, we can draw a lot of parallel and kind of understand his influences a little bit. So let's get into what made King Ludwig the mad one after all. And this all begins with his boyhood at Schloss Hohenschwangau. Now, I say Schloss here on purpose. It's actually a German distinction here. Schloss would be more of a palace, whereas Burg would be the word for castle. But if you look there on the right, that's Hohenschwangau, and it looks an awful lot like a castle. There's a reason for that. We will get into that in just a moment. Now, on the left there, you see the royal family, his family. Seated there is his mother, Marie of Prussia. Standing to her left is Maximilian II, his father, who was the king before him. There's our boy Ludwig on mom's right shoulder, the taller boy. And on the left there is his younger brother Otto, who would later become king after him, and arguably was more mad than he was. Now, let's talk about this childhood because it was a bit of a lonely one. Maximilian II was a very absent father. He was a busy man. I mean, he was the king. Uh, he was not around a lot to be a part of Ludwig's life, and he was spent most of the time under the watch of his mother Marie. Now, by all accounts, in a number of places, and including Ludwig's own writings, Marie was a bit of a hateful woman, and she did not seem to care for Ludwig very much. For whatever reason, she either found him too frivolous or too feminine or uh, too obsessed with dreams and poetry and art. And she just didn't really take care for him and was pretty mean to him or just outright avoided him. Now, the only solace that Ludwig probably had was that he had a pretty awesome summer vacation home and spent a number of years of his boyhood there at Hohenschwangau. Now, let's go briefly into the origins of this castle. It was built in 1833 through 1837 by his father, Maximilian II, and it was actually placed on the ruins of a medieval castle, um, technically Schwanstein Castle. So there's some naming conventions that'll get a little confusing here because there were actually three castles in this region back in the Middle Ages. One was Schwanstein, the location of Hohenschwangau, but there was a double castle where our other castle of concern was located, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Uh, Vorder Hohenschwangau and Hinter Hohenschwangau, essentially front and back Schwangau. They were basically just connected by a moat in between them, but were two separate structures. Fortunately, all of these had fallen into ruin by the time we hit the 19th century. And Maximilian II was, he passed on a lot of his traits to his son. He was very, very obsessed with the medieval period, obsessed with the absolute power of the monarchy and what they used to have. And Ludwig certainly picked up on some of this. But Maximilian definitely started it, and he did that by purchasing this land here and rebuilding a castle on the site of the old Schwanstein Castle. And as you can see, it is very much medieval. Now, uh, because he spent so much time here, Ludwig had an opportunity to be surrounded by the fantastical, and this led to a growing fascination with medieval life, with myth and fantasy, and ultimately the works of Richard Wagner, which we will talk about momentarily. But I want to make sure we talk a little bit about Hohenschwangau first of all, and mention the architectural features. You can notice there on the front and certainly from the outside, it was built in that Gothic revival style that would have been very French inspired. We're going to talk a lot about that French connection in a little bit, but I wanted to make sure I mentioned that's where a lot of that came from. Uh, because he grew up in a castle, there was a bit of a rose tinted fascination with that medieval life. The notion that they were king by the grace of God and they had absolute authority. This was kind of coming out of vogue by the time we're hitting the 19th century, but this is still something that they were really interested in. But something else that definitely impacted Ludwig was the manner in which myth and fantasy was portrayed throughout the castle. And as you can see on some of the murals there's a number of artistic renderings of German fantasies. In particular, the most prominent of those is the story of Lohengrin, or the Swan Knight. The Swan Knight, the whole swan thing was very, very important to Ludwig. One of his many monikers beyond Mad King was the Fairy Tale King or the Swan King. And that's because of this fascination with swans. They trace their origin back to the Counts of Swangau, which goes way back to the Middle Ages, and was an order that traced its legendary roots back to the Grail Knights in Parsifal. And whether or not any of this was true or not, it certainly was a point of fascination for this family. And you can see on the walls a number of these images are painted. And so Ludwig grows up surrounded by all these stories. One issue that definitely played in, and we'll certainly talk about this, um, was the manner in which Germany was trying to find its own way. It was still very much a series of separate nations. And over this time period, you're going to begin to see a reunification. Part of that was the formation of a very specific German cultural identity And that was a function of latching onto these stories, these mythic tales, and creating a uniquely German mythology, something that wasn't really present. Uh, Now, what fed into this fascination ultimately was Ludwig's meeting with Richard Wagner. Now, you've probably heard of Wagner. He was a significant German composer, and composed a number of operas. Most of these operas, if you've ever seen them, if you think about the stereotypical opera lady with the horns and the spear, Brunhilde, you're thinking about Wagner. It's very bombastic. It's always very mythic and epic, and it is generally related to these German stories. Ludwig got exposed to Wagner's work fairly early on in his life. He saw two different operas in 1861, Tannhäuser, but more importantly, Lohengrin. And Lohengrin was about that swan night, right? And so he really latched onto Wagner's work and ultimately became much more involved with Wagner later in his life. But it's important to know that while he was growing up, he was making these connections. Last thing I want to point out on this slide, if you look in the left-hand most picture, you'll see a piano there, and that has likely been played by Richard Wagner a number of times on his many later visits to this castle. Now, unfortunately, Ludwig didn't only have a childhood in which he felt isolated. He had a great deal of trauma as a young man that put him in a difficult position. He rapidly ascended into power in his 18th year. His father passed away very suddenly from illness in 1864. This was not expected, and he very quickly became the king when he was not ready to be the king. You can see him here on the right. That's Ludwig in his coronation outfit. Again, that's how he's very typically portrayed, but it would not have been necessarily something he enjoyed. And he kind of came into a bad situation pretty early on. He rose to the throne in 1864, and by 1866, the Austro-Prussian War had begun. It's also known as the Seven Weeks' War, for pretty obvious reasons. Um, and in this war, there was a battle between Prussia, the northern parts of Germany, as led by Otto von Bismarck, and Austria, and their allies, one of whom was Bavaria. In this very short war, as pictured on a battle here at the left, the Bavarians fell to the Prussian forces in fairly short order, and they were absorbed ultimately into the unified German state. Um, this robbed Bavaria of its sovereignty. Um, and for someone who grew up with the notion that kings were there by the grace of God and given absolute authority, this was pretty tough on Ludwig. He wasn't a fan. He wrote that he considered himself a machine for signing documents, and this really gave him a great deal of trouble throughout the whole of his reign. He was not satisfied being a king in the traditional sense because he couldn't be a king in the traditional sense. He was basically there as a puppet to run the government for his larger lords in Prussia. So, consequently, he retreated a bit into his passions. He was not a very active leader. In fact, he was quite reclusive. Now, some of this comes from his childhood. He was very obsessed with the works of Friedrich Schiller. He was his favorite poet. But Schiller also had a theory about art in particular, and about the manner in which leaders should rule. He talks about the dynamic state, which is the government, versus the aesthetic state. Now, the dynamic state was in Ludwig's mind. That's the material work. That's the work of making sure the laws going appropriately, making sure people are getting all the stuff they need, things are getting built, wars are being fought, all those little minutiae of actually governing a country. He was under the impression that actually fell to his parliament and his government. The king's job was to build the aesthetic state. Now, the aesthetic state was this lofty idea that you would give the people freedom by freedom. The individual leaves behind the chains of utility and sensual desire and recognizes their own humanity by being exposed to great works and art and being immersed in a culture. And so Ludwig took it upon himself to, he said, well, if I can't govern properly, I'm going to leave my mark artistically. And that he did. I talk about only one castle in this presentation, but he built a number of them. Um, and not only castles, but there's a great deal of work he did on architecture all throughout his country. And this was in part because he wanted to reclaim some of this Bavarian identity. Now, to his primary passions that he retreated into, or of course music, art, and architecture. Music, I've already alluded to a bit, uh, was typified for him by Richard Wagner, and he is famously his patron. He would go on to fund a number of his works, um, including famous ones such as the Ring Cycle, you may have heard of. It's a 4 opera cycle that basically tells the entire mythology of Germany, quote unquote, as it were, the German mythic history that had not previously been in existence. Ludwig heavily funded Wagner's works. He had special previews for himself in some of his castles, and spent a lot of time corresponding with Wagner. We'll talk about this a little at the end. It's interesting if you read the correspondences. Ludwig was very taken with Richard Wagner, and not necessarily just as an artist. While he certainly is writing from a time where it would have been more common for men to be more affectionate, perhaps, in their writings, this was another step further. And we do know that uh, Ludwig famously struggled with his sexuality. He writes about this all the time in his diary. He did have male lovers, and he was more than likely a homosexual at a time where it would not have been okay to be one. Um, and we talk about this some at the end, but his writings to Wagner are very much as coming from a lover, someone who loves him. Now, we don't have any reason to think that Wagner reciprocated these feelings, and he himself wrote about how he was pretty sure that Ludwig loved him. Um, but that definitely certainly fed into what was already just a fascination with his writings. You can see here on the right. I was sorry, I mentioned the Ring Cycle. This is actually an original set design that was intended for the first Das Rheingold. That is the Rhine maidens losing the ring at the very beginning. If you're interested in the Ring Cycle at all, you should check it out. Definitely some. You can see where Tolkien maybe got some of his inspiration with the whole ring idea. Um, in any case, so music, a huge part of that. He spent a great deal of time dedicated to that, and we will certainly see its influences on his buildings. But he was also fascinated, certainly, with architecture and art. This is where he gained the moniker of the fairy tale king. A lot of his designs were actually very theatrical on purpose. Neuschwanstein, as it were, and I will get into this, was designed by a set designer, an operatic set designer. And you could see how this castle building, though, you could see how it ties into his boyhood experience. He grew up in a castle. He grew up surrounded by these myths. He had a need to reclaim some monarchical power. And part of this was because they heavily identified with the Bourbon dynasty in France. Now, I mentioned this before, how this was probably not a very popular move. By 1870, we were into the Franco-Prussian War, where the unified German state was fighting France, which ultimately resulted in a unified Germany, the Second Reich, which existed until we reached World War I, right? Um, but his connection to the Bourbons goes way back, and he heavily identified with that. His godfather was Ludwig I, and Ludwig I's godfather was Louis XVI. Now, because of this connection, both Maximilian II, Ludwig's father, and Ludwig himself heavily identify with the French dynasty. For two reasons. Because Louis XVI then would have been related to two other very important Louis. One, Louis XIV, who famously built Versailles, was deeply associated with monarchical absolutism and the power of the monarchy, but also Louis IX, or Saint Louis, who you may recall from some of our readings late here in the course. And further, by legend, Tristan of Tristan and Isolde fame was the son of Louis IX. Now, that's a legend, of course, but this certainly formed the material of another Wagnerian opera, was another German storytelling device. So you can see how this all ties in. Because he was so associated with the French, he loved their castles. He loved the way their monarchs had so much power. He wanted to be the same. He very heavily identified with France. Unfortunately, because being identified with France at a time when your country's fighting France is probably not super popular, this was ultimately one of the justifications used to declare him a madman. Now, we want to get actually here to Neuschwanstein Castle. Um, you actually may have seen this castle before. Um, it's a very famous image. Overhead shots of it are used in the film Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. The castle is also the inspiration for Sleeping Beauty's castle in Disneyland. So there you go. On the left-hand side, you can see the proximity of Neuschwanstein to Hohenschwangau on the right. So they were very, very close together. This was very much by design, and of course, this castle was built on the ruins of the other two that had fallen previously. So this was just a reclamation of this old castle land. You could see how it back when it was intended as a castle, it would have been probably quite an advantageous spot for such a thing. If you look on the right, just some more images. You could see the original design sketch there, the hand-drawn picture there in the middle on the right. Below it is its actual construction. You could see there was a few things missing. It did not ultimately get finished. Construction began for this castle in 1868, and regrettably, Ludwig did not live to see its completion, which is why you could see there's a central keep that would have been located there. If you look at the bottom right, you could see on the left-hand side of the castle, there's kind of a big opening there in the courtyard. There would have been more structures there. Once Ludwig passed away, there was little more construction on the castle. He built this castle with the idea of escaping. He did not ever intend for it to be open to the public necessarily. Um, he continued to live in Hohenschwangau once he was king. His mother actually was still alive and actually outlived Ludwig by a year. So Ludwig stuck here in Hohenschwangau with his mother, who he hates, in a job that he doesn't enjoy. And so he is longing for a place to go. Reportedly, Ludwig's bedroom in Hohenschwangau had a telescope that could see up to the construction process on Neuschwanstein. So he was constantly fascinated with it. You will see as we get inside, this is myth and storytelling brought to life. Just a hideous castle, as you can see. A number of interior shots here. But you may see some things that are familiar to you. Again, we have some of that Gothic style all throughout the vaulted ceilings, the pillars. You could see a number of murals. I'm here to tell you that many of them are related to works of Richard Wagner. And it would not be unfair to consider this castle essentially a temple to the work of Wagner. He was so deeply fascinated by it that he intended this place to be not only his personal residence, but a place where Wagner's works could be performed. At the very bottom in the middle, you will see the Singers' Hall, and he intended to have a number of performances right here in the castle. It was supposed to be just constantly bustling, just the center of Wagnerism here, right? Uh, but ultimately, you could tell here. There's a focus on the mythic. You could see the swan imagery up there in the top left. You could see at in the top of the middle. You could see Parsifal, the Grail Knight. It's just rife with imagery. And this is all by design. This is his boyhood home blown up and put in a larger space, and that's all part of it. The proximity to Hohenschwangau was conspicuous. It was by design. This was meant as a reclamation of medieval power. It was meant to exude that. It's important to note, and I don't know if I mentioned this yet, all of these buildings that he constructs, there is some popular conception that he bankrupted the state of Bavaria building these buildings. That was not the case. These were all from his personal funds. If anything, he only bankrupted himself. Another thing that may, again, and I alluded to some of this, that may have led to his need for escape, is that he was just deeply misunderstood. He was reclusive. He was very well read. an artistic and a dreamer, and he was also likely a homosexual. And that was known amongst his inner circle and not super well accepted, particularly by his delightful mother. And he would have been looking for a place to go. This would have served as that place. It looks extremely ostentatious, and you may think of this as the worst of monarchy right here, just spending sums and sums of money on something like this. But I don't necessarily interpret it that way. I see this as a man who was in a lot of pain, who never got to reckon with his father's death and was put into power way too soon, who had a mom that didn't really particularly love him, who has a younger brother who has deep mental health issues. He has a sexual identity that he can't openly express. And he's desperately grasping for power. He has it in his mind that he's the king by God's right, and that was not allowed to happen for him. And so with Wagner particularly, he was able to see in that the notion of German pride and a German identity, and he really, really linked that here to this construction. Oh, spoiler alert, he does die. But let's get a little bit into his downfall because I need to wrap this up here. Ultimately, he does have a sad ending. Um, he, again, as I mentioned, spent vast sums of his personal money building all of these structures. But ultimately, this did come to a head. In 1885, his creditors were getting pretty antsy with him, wanting his money back, wanting their money back, and he was not able to pay. Reportedly, he actually threatened suicide to his creditors if they were to take any of his structures away. So they seem to have reneged on that. Um, but ultimately, in 1886, he made overtures finally to the cabinet to ask for money to help pay some of his debts. This was the first time he really actually invoked the need for the government to assist him. And of course, they outright refused. There's a bit of political intrigue surrounding how this ultimately may have happened. But in very short order, in June of 1886, uh, the move was put into place by the Parliament to declare Ludwig II insane. Some of this could have been social factors. This he likely suffered from some form of mental illness, possibly, if nothing else, depression. The factors dealing with his sexuality, the manner in which he was so reclusive. Apparently, he was often up at night and sleeping during the day. So he had some oddities about him. But this allowed them to declare him mad. And we don't necessarily know the reason why this ultimately may have occurred. I suspect could have been a little more to it. Um, but he was declared insane, and on June 11th, he was finally removed from his position and banished to Berg Castle, which Berg being the word for castle. Castle feels a bit redundant, but here we are. This was near a place called Lake Sternberg. Now, he went there with in the care of his psychiatrist, the man who actually declared him insane. And only 2 days later, on June 13th, 1886, he went for a walk with his psychiatrist near the lake. That's pictured there on the right, tastefully presented in what apparently was a contemporaneous postcard. I don't know why I'd want a postcard of the last walk of the King Ludwig, but there he goes. Apparently, the two men walked off together and were never seen again. They were both found, well, never seen alive again. They were both found drowned in the lake under rather mysterious circumstances. There was no witnesses. We don't know if Ludwig tried to run and the doctor tried to pursue them and they both drowned. We don't know if somebody assassinated them and the doctor had to be shut up. There's some conflicting accounts as to whether or not there was actually water in his lungs. But of course, there's certainly a possibility of a dry drowning. There's a lot of questions surrounding his death. It is a bit sketchy. But unfortunately, June 13th, 1886, King Ludwig II died at a rather young age. And the crown passed to his brother, Otto, and that was unfortunately the end of his short and tragic life. So, to sum up, what is the legacy? I mean, we have a man who, in his short amount of time, built an incredible number of beautiful structures. I encourage you to, if you ever have an opportunity, to look at some of his other castles, you should. One of them was a recreation of Versailles, which is stunning. He has a number of other things that he did. Um, was it right to call him mad? I don't know. If you were living in that time, I imagine his behavior would have been pretty shocking. But looking back at his writings and looking back at his many influences between his father's teachings about the monarchy, between his connection to the Bourbon dynasty, his connection to all the German mythic identity, growing up in a castle, growing up surrounded by fantasy and story, and then just becoming obsessed with the work of a composer who was working very hard to create a unique German mythic identity, you could see how this all coalesced into a man who wanted to express himself. I think he was probably just a man who was ill suited to be the king. But there's no question that he was well read, and no question that he had an artist's soul. And it's reflective in all of his work. And fortunately for us, we get to visit these castles today. Blessedly, those the two castles, Neuschwanstein and Hohenschwangau, both survived World War II. They were apparently were used for storing stolen French artifacts by the Nazi Party, but no harm came to the buildings, and they are toured constantly to this day. So that's pretty much all I have, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. They're certainly beautiful structures, and he was certainly a complicated man. But I hope if you've heard of Mad King Ludwig before, that you may have watched this and thought to yourself, maybe a little more to the guy. Thank you.